Okay, I hope your holidays are all going fine. And I got a bit of a Christmas present here, but something that actually showed up 4 years ago. I recently did a couple of videos showing different aspects of Christmas and how this works together, where it was a Gnostic interpretation, which actually involved dragons and things like that, that was not kept in the Bible, but it was right there. In fact, that was kept till a much more modern time, and you can see that in the stained glass work that's well known around in cathedrals and so on. And that cathedral time has something to do with it too, but what we're talking about here, or what Joe's going to talk about, and I'll interject, is about ancient rites and mushrooms and how that connects to Santa Claus. Now, his conversations always seem to get to something like this, and he's talking to some naturalist dude, but that guy's got something more going on for sure. I don't know who he is actually by name and so on, but he's talking about people hanging around the forest and trees and being more like nature or something here. And then all of a sudden he goes off into this idea. And so let's look into this and get a bit of an idea, because this makes some connections that I've made in recent videos and old videos too, where I mentioned about this same type of thing. I don't want to go off into drugs are about everything or anything like that, but how much of a part did it play in ancient religion, people coming up with things, innovations, all type of things were done from something like this. Let's listen.
Do you know the story of the Amanita muscaria?
I know what they are. I don't know the story.
The Amanita muscaria is the most fascinating one to me because that's the one that looks like Santa Claus.
Or the Mario
It's
Kart
red with white.
mushroom.
Yeah. That is the subject of a book by a guy named John Marco Allegro, who was one of the head scholars for deciphering the Dead Sea Scrolls. He deciphered the Dead Sea Scrolls for 14 years. He was an ordained minister, but he was also, in his study of theology, became agnostic. And when he started realizing that there was all these different religions that had similar stories, and he was, found all these different connections, and he was trying to like figure out what the origins of all these stories were. Well,
Okay, that'd be a good place to break in. So what he's telling you is this ordained priest that was in that guise, given the idea of deciphering the Dead Sea Scrolls and working on them in a theological point, actually after 14 years worth of work, but it happened, he figured it out before then, and then it got deeper and he had to roll back around through it and verify his idea and stuff. But after 14 years, this scholar just studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. So he was all into it and then not, by just studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, why? Because he saw that so many people were interjecting all these things that were mythology to the point that it actually just fell apart. And so he became agnostic a little bit, but the thing that he found that was profound in these Gnostic writings that you could still see somewhat, but it was woven mysteriously into the Gnostic teachings and writings, and everything was there was this secret thing, but if you knew what they were referring to, you could figure it out. And there are a few different forms of this. I've talked about how hemp has a connection to this, how the acacia tree with DMT has a connection to this, and the burning bush, and so on. But in this point here, we're talking about Santa Claus mushrooms, and people call them that sometimes in a modern day, but they're Amanita muscaria. And so it has something to do with actually the ancient god mask, which I went into a video 2 Christmases ago, and that has to do with Halloween and masquerades and things like that. But and the drama idea of the mask that they wear and all this, and ancient rituals that connect back to the way back machine on that. And now it was utilized in a more modern form in different ways of something that was much more ancient and archaic. But what this guy found here that he's talking about is that a lot of the stories seem to be about this red cap mushroom. and it's red with little white dots on it. It looks like it's got snowflakes on it, or stars. There's a connection to Mars. In fact, it said it just a minute ago where he said Mars red. And Aries, which is connected to Mars. But let's just go on and hear what this guy's, hear what Joe says about this guy and the connections, and then watch how he takes that and does what I do and pulls about 3 connections off, although I might interject in between it. That's what's going to be going on.
After studying the Dead Sea Scrolls for, I think it was 14 years before he wrote this book, he decided that all of Christianity was a massive misunderstanding. And what it was originally about was these stories, this collection of stories that were about fertility rituals and psychedelic mushroom use. And he traced the word Jesus back to an ancient Sumerian word that was a mushroom covered in God's semen. And that when God would come on the earth, that's what rain was. Rain was God coming on the earth. And that these mushrooms would rise up out of the ground. They would eat them and trip their fucking balls off, right?
That's a crazy.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. And hopefully the sound's coming through, but that's also why I left the closed caption off. You can see it here. So there's these ancient fertility rites, what he's talking about. And again, I'm going to say that some of these things are not they're not in a modern time, so you can't look at them in that aspect. But they're, people back then still had animism, like you can see in Egypt, but you see the same thing in Sumerians and so on, and making connections to like the way that an eagle does this is the way that I do that, and all of these things. It's a real connective. In fact, we're talking about the people that were kind of the elves, that were one with the land and doing all of this and stuff, and supposedly lived a whole long time. Well, you look at their stories, they say it. In the Bible, they tell you people lived a whole long time. What are we talking about? Well, they had 20 years. Oh, the satyr type people, where they were the ones that raised goats, so they turned around and had these effigies off that. Well, now we've, of course, turned the world in a flip-flop. A couple thousand years ago, and it took a while for it to really take on, but to separate ourselves from what everything had come from, but take the best out of it in some ways and try to blend it into a story. We came up with these new ones. And because that was built with Greeks and so on that we talked about, and the Septuagint and the way that it came about being heralded, it ended up encapsulating everyone and really not some little people that lived in one little place at one time. But to unpack more of what he said there, because there was a lot in that. So there's an ancient Sumerian word that Jesus actually has to go back with. And I've shown that in a couple of different videos where the Jesus idea comes back from a Wayback Machine. But that's a retelling of the tale of Dumuzi. And in the Dumuzi tale, there's a sacred grove of trees. And this tree is described as having a clear ring around it, like it's cleared out, and then there's a sacred tree in the middle of it. You can find this same description and idea and concepts going on with the Druids too, by the way, and the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and a lot of people. In fact, Abraham comes over and he plants a tree. And it's got a lot to do with this, and symbology of planting a tree that you know that you won't even be able to possibly get the fruits off of, or you might be able to see it come to fruition, and then everybody else is going to enjoy it. This is an idea of also whenever you get to have a commune with God, because these people thought whenever they got real high that it felt like they were having commune with God. This is where the word high comes from. Well, you feel kind of like you're floating. You feel kind of, no. It's where the whole concept of whenever you're buzzed on a lot of different drugs, they would refer it to it. It's also why they use alcohol a little bit in church and everything, because that takes away your inhibition, so you kind of go more with it. But nowadays they only drink a little shot glass of it. And of course we talked about incense and having to do with cannabism, and actually that was hemp. In fact, there's been proven that on the altar there, they scraped some off of it and checked it, and they're like THC big time. That had to do with it too. And Oh, were people getting a contact buzz and contact high here and being able to commune with God and these, things like that? It's funny how that just all starts to make sense. But then drugs are used in the wrong way now, or this, that, and the other and stuff. Well, are they? I mean, if you do it and you're just not trying to do that, what happens? Or, it's crazy because it's a ritual hooked up with medicine. But like, we don't really nowadays, whenever we take a pain pill, nobody dances around and says some things for 15 minutes and then it starts going away. And then they change the ritual because they know you're getting numb and do something else and then stop and then go, you feel all right? Yeah. And then you feel like he had something to do with it and it all went together when really you took a Vicodin. It takes about 10-15 minutes to kick in or whatever off of it, and he may have given you alcohol drink to do with it or something else that helps kick it in and washes it into your stomach. There's all kinds of things that went along with these rituals. But that was what we talk about with ancient magic, And these fertility rites that he's talking about are when people had agriculture and before, and the concept of how it all just pops up and springs up. And things got taken from place to place and grown out, and they didn't understand that people just generations before them had already Johnny Appleseeded these whole areas, like agriculture, but they weren't doing total agriculture yet. They were just Johnny Appleseeding stuff. So a grove of apple trees ended up getting spread by the seeds, by birds too, but by people. And a grove happens, and so on. And there's a belief where the ancient cedar forest had all come from that. And, the sacred one of Lebanon and all this type stuff, which used to be a giant forest. If you want to, think of Yellowstone or someplace like that, or up in the northwest of the Americas, and you'll get an idea of that. Now, there's all these cedar trees in there, and that was sacred because cedar trees don't rot. Cedar works fantastic in that way. They talk about using that for gates and all kinds of things, and it was sacred and everything. So there are certain trees do certain things. These pine trees, and these conifers, these evergreen trees were real important. Whenever there was a winter would come in, you would look out across and winter would take over, and then a snow would happen. It would all look like it turned gray, white to dead, and it lost all of its color. It literally went to a black and white TV. And all the trees lost their leaves, and you know that was the growth of life and everything in them, so it looks like everything's dying. But if you look over there, there's this one tree. It's got kind of a ring around it a little bit under the bottom of it, and it, even though it has some snow on it, it's still green and acts like this is not a problem. These are pine trees and stuff like that, and this is sacred and for everybody. The black lacquer tar bitumen solution that is painted on the ancient Egyptians to help preserve them comes from ancient conifer trees from up in this area. They've checked it out now. They've supposedly done a secondary look on it where is it from up over more in Europe or is it more over here, because they can tell by looking at it supposedly, but then I never got an answer back. So either it was, well, we can't really tell, or they don't want to. So we have that idea too. But let me kick it back to Dumuzi one more time real quick, and I'll let Joe talk. Gosh, is that Dumuzi in his ancient story, if you look in the ancient Sumerians and tell of a Wayback Machine, and they tell you that this is an idea that comes before people made bread. And in your mind you can say, well, the Sumerians may have thought it was around here, so you're giving it a couple thousand years ago. Or the reality that we found bread and mortars and pestles to make it and everything that date back 16,000 years or more easily. But when did people start making bread? Anyhow, this tale of Dumuzi is a story where, I wish I'd just flip to it right now, but he gets born out of a pine tree every year right around winter solstice. How does this all work? What's the thing? Well, there are people that say that this has more to do with this mushroom concept and rituals then they lead on, because that's a known concept to them, and they're not trying to throw out to everybody how and why and where they meet God or the gods to everybody. So it's kind of a secret thing, but we talk about red caps. Well, in my game, there's these little bitty people that are red capped and they have these strange red caps on them. Well, there's a story with little people that always happens when you take these drugs too, but then also there's a concept that one people were tall at this time and one people were short, and it's not that big of a difference like giants like you think, but it pretty much comes that way. I mean, go up next to a basketball player and you're like, man, you're a here we go. So the red caps of the Phrygians that you see in Mithras statues and all these things on it, and the idea of that being a red cap that has to do with people that had to do with red ochre symbology and things that go into the Wayback Machine. So you can say portions of this probably go back hundreds of thousands of years, seriously. But when we developed all this, whenever you look back, you really have to give it so much discredit at a point that, like, you're just, I don't know, maybe, and then if you take another step, you can't say much because there's not enough validation, and you'll start coming up with assumptions and saying, what if, what if, what if. But this seems to go back well before the Sumerians that he mentioned there, and this idea of the rain of God being what fertilizes the earth, Mother Earth, and here we go, and everything grows up out of it, and you can see symbology that goes along with that, with all these river civilizations that run off this idea of that. In fact, in Egypt, the idea is that the guy jerked off and ended up making the Nile and doing all this type stuff. Well, you know, whenever everybody could have said, well, this is a woman and she gets wet. Oh, you don't want to say, never mind. Okay. So these concepts go with fertility and with people and with the world. And it's like concepts that are imbinding on everything and everything around you. Whenever you have one of these experiences, there might be certain things that stand out, and there's a point of view for that. But the idea that you have an understanding for the whole world. And you can imagine if you did something like that and started watching some Joe Rogan or some cool old Nova programs and stuff like that, what you might think of and end up making connections that you probably would have never been to because you wouldn't have been in that state. And we call that high, but everybody in ancient times considered it a commune with God, whether it was alcohol or anything that deviated you away to where you would have an experience. So let's go back to Joe.
Easy story.
So maybe you got to think.
Yeah.
People that were foraging for food, especially back when there was no agriculture, right? I mean, it was touch and go. You could easily starve to death. A bad winter, a drought, people would starve to death. It was very, very common. So they would take foraging extremely serious, and they knew what they could eat, and they knew what they couldn't eat. Well, they knew that there was a relationship between carnivorous trees, and carnivorous trees would grow these weird looking shiny red and white mushrooms under them. That's what coniferous trees is, pine trees. That's what we use for Christmas trees.
Yeah.
Those red and white packages, they are like the shiny packages underneath the Christmas tree. They are the color of Santa Claus.
Yeah.
They're common in Siberia. They're eaten constantly by caribou. Caribou are reindeer. Reindeer are addicted to these, to the point where when people are having psychedelic mushroom rituals and they go outside to take a leak, the caribou will knock them over to get to the Amanita muscaria piss in the sand because they smell the Amanita muscaria in the piss.
Okay, that's a whole lot to unpack right there. But that sounds like me sometimes right there, where we went flipping through this and this, that, and the other, and Santa Claus and da-da-da and everything, making connections. Although usually I go off in left field trying to explain and make mother connections to each one. But it's just as simple to go like this too, and the same idea. That's where the symbolic color goes with on a lot of things, right? And so a coloration has to do with it, but then also the ritual and the concept and the meeting of God and all of these other things comes from this idea that's going on that these shamans would do. I mean, yeah, even to this day, you can find the shaman. Well, what happens? Well, he gets real high, and then he comes and tells you what he thinks about the things that's going on as a problem, because he gets an idea, or he communes somehow, or things happen, so on like that. Well, do we think that our politicians should just go and get real high and then come back and then go da da da? You know what? That might actually work, but I don't think we're willing in a real closed-minded society that we have now in the modern day to take something like that into any serious thought at all. But yeah, there's this thing where, like they when they go and do the ayahuasca and trips and everything, and Joe talks about it all the time. Seems like he gets there most of his conversations. Um, Whenever you go to Siberia and you do these mushroom tripping things or whatever, and they'll do it in like a little lodge or whatever that you'd think would be like a fishing little thing or whatever, or sometimes they'll do it in an old thing that they've made up. And there's a bunch of different ways, and a lot of times they try to do it in a commune with nature, and you've got to do this hike in the thing for a while, or they might take you on a dog sled journey or whatever, and da da da, and you end up at this lodge that they have, and oh, this is a cool little place tucked into nowhere or whatever, and then you get high on it. Well, and you're in the middle of nowhere, so you go outside and piss and then come back in and everything, and then all of a sudden you check it out and there's reindeer all around, and they're coming up to you or right there, and they don't want to get away because they're attracted to that smell from a distance, almost like some kind of catnip situation that he's talking about. So here we go with that reindeer thing and stuff like that. And in a minute, we're going to make the attachment to the idea of Catal Hoyuk and how they come in from the roofs. But in later times, even when we had doors, here's the thing. We made doors where they open to the outside for most periods of time. That's just the way it was fabricated, because you look from the outside and you want to armor it towards the opening and doing these things, and it goes that way. It doesn't open to the inside. In a modern day, well, even up north more than in south, you'll see that they don't open up that way. They open up inside. So you're actually allowing somebody to come in and doing that welcoming situation or whatever. But also, those really help whenever it gets snowed up. Because I remember when I was a kid just in Nebraska, we got up enough snow where we opened up the door. Of course, I was like 3 or 4. When you opened up the door, I was looking over snow. I would have had to jump over the snow to do it. Parents could just take a stride over or whatever, but it's still the problem there, and you can get snowed in or whatever. But at the time, these people in their dwellings, they also had a catch on the top of it where you could make it in from the top. That's a concept of like we have an attic today, and they had a way up. So if you were ever snowed in, people would go from the inside. That's not the true connective, because the real true connective, it seems, in the mythological test, which Joe doesn't talk about, he's just making connections in Sumerian the way it goes at that point. But it seems like these all converge back where that Tigris and Euphrates converged back, and the point over here in the Caucasus Mountains and so on, and these certain people that were there. And do we have a people at that time? Yeah, we've got Catal Hoyuk, and they've got pictures of these guys and these caribou or reindeer right there. In fact, there's one depiction of him where there's a sled and there's people waving at him, and then there's these caribou, and you could go, you want to make up a Santa Claus story? Well, it seems like these people, spread it through Bellbeaker and other cultures and stuff, had a common mythos that went through this that ends up coming down to us as the tales that we wove into what we have for Christmas and Santa Claus. Here's a weird one for you before I go back. Whenever you go around the globe and you have these lateral lines that are on that, as the world spins per day, that's a declination of time. And every 15 degrees is like an hour, isn't it? Something like that. And so it goes all the way around. You have 12 and 12 and 24 and 360-degree globe. This all comes from the Sumerians too, so they have this all figured out. But in their tale of this wizard from the north that they have in their story, and this thing that happens, there's an idea in it that goes from 2 different people and in 2 different stories that mythological people say this isn't really related, but it comes from something older that had it. And so it's other people's variation on a theme that, when it's spinning around and the world's spinning around, so you would have hours going on, and you can see how those lines converge and they get much skinnier and go around, and they end up going to a point to where there's this God that's beyond time and Santa Claus, and he lives forever. And how does he get everywhere? And how does he do all these things? Well, amazingly, he does all these things because he controls time. There's a connection to Chronos. Chronos is Saturn, and that's also El of the ancient Canaanites. So here's another whole connection on the idea of how it works with time. We even tell kids that how he does it is he starts over here and he goes that way, going against the travel of the sun and everything, and do it. And you know, it takes till you get old enough to realize that he couldn't even do your hometown in a night. There's no way possible. But we try to carry it on, and it's a heritage thing. And it's kind of funny looking back at it. People, you know, like, why do we do all this thing? Why it's got all these things connected to it and everything? It's because something that we had from way back, and it's still there with colors and symbology and lights, which used to be little torches in the distance when people were going and doing things like that. But they also tell you in the Sumerians, they used to bring you, if they say it in the Bible, and almost like a dismissive thing where these people take a tree and they bring it indoors and they decorate it with stars and da da da, and it's a symbol of their god and so on like that. Who is that? That's the earliest known Jesus, but actually we know that that's a holotype written off of somebody that we don't even know existed. Who comes before that? See, we know a lot of people leech off the Sumerians now, and that came before a lot of the other peoples there, but who came before that, and who can we tag those onto? And those points are so minor, there's no writing, things like that happens to where you can say, well, they had something like that going on. We can even find cave paintings at 30,000 years old that are showing Taurus and these connections to a bull and the Pleiades and all these other things. So they had portions of these things going on, but without writing or representation, we can't find anything that makes a connective that would be able to show you how far this goes back. The only what we can do is take a conjecture idea where these common people came from this one area, and they all spread out, and they had stories that ended up becoming variations on a theme because of their difference over time. Time plays a lot of things into this, you know, the passage of time and so on. But then again, hey, this God of the North situation, what made him be able to control time is he's at the North Pole, which if you're on that side of the world, in the old world there, that's up in Siberia and stuff, and the tales that come from there, and the Winter Warlock. And he controls an ancient dragon. And the dragon was on the other side in his cave, but he came over, and all he had to do was whoosh his wings and come down, and that caused so much wind. But because he's an ice dragon of winter, it ends up causing that northern to come down, which is really just the pivoting of the earth and then the sun and a representation to it. But this is mythology from older times. So there's some other connectives, but hopefully let's just go ahead and get back to Joe here, because he's still going to make a couple more connectives in this.
And one of the ways these guys trip their balls off is they eat the mushroom and then they drink their own urine. They have a second process of this. Here's where it gets even crazier. In the time...
Let's not let that get any crazier before we refer to that. There's this idea that if you do it normally, that your urine actually that you pee out, which your body says, hey, foreign thing, and it tries to reject it out, will be more concentrated than the original bit by about 40%, right? Now, there's ways that you can turn around and mess with that liquid and try to purify it and do things like that after it, but he's telling you just people used to just do this, like the reindeers. I mean, they saw the reindeers doing it, and it's like, why are they so freaky over it? Somebody decided to try it one time, and they ended up having a heroic dose. If you know what I'm talking about, you know, a heroic dose would be just on the edge and a little too much. In drinking, that would get you to the point that you're probably puking or right on the edge or whatever, and it wouldn't be a real great experience. Same thing would go on here, and it wouldn't be a great experience if you didn't know what you were doing and things. But when you reach that point there, you are really tripping. You need to be on the right people and all these things going on, the right atmosphere and all those things that go with it. But in doing so, you have what's called a heroic dose. What's that? Well, a lot of these people that used to be warriors, like the Vikings and stuff, used to get all lit up and go into battle and stuff like that. They were heroic. They were invincible. People talked about them. They were just coming through us, cutting heads off and shit. It was we had to run. Who was that? That's us Romans and stuff. And they tried to mess with them. These people were not to be messed with. They had things from ancient time where they would do this, and also they had a thing of the master of the hunt that they went through that had to do with deer horns and trying to, hide among the things and all kinds of stuff that we would look at nowadays. And in a certain light is really that elven type experience where they were one with nature and so on. A lot like we try to dream all the Amerindians used to be, but there's only some that acted that way and some that acted totally different. They really weren't a cohesive unit in any way, but that's not for the scope of this video. We're talking about Joe Rogan on mushrooms, man. Let's get back to it, and this idea that urine, whenever your body evacuates, is actually stronger and everything, and that's why the caribou go after it. And I guess somebody got desperate enough to go ahead and try it. Anyhow, crazier.
Times in Siberia where it would become extremely snowy. When the shaman would visit, the way they would get into the house is through the fucking chimney, because the door would be snowed in. So they would climb in through the chimney. I mean, there's so many parallels to Santa Claus and to Christianity, to this one mushroom that they think was a massive part of shamanistic rituals. There it is right there.
This is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Yeah. Oh, that is
That's
Rudolph
so crazy.
I'm sure.
That's such a...
And they say Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And so now you get an idea where maybe the story and how this one reindeer got lit up, and then other people got the idea and they ate a mushroom off of it, and ho, ho, ho happened out of it. Kind of weird, to look at where all this comes from, and it could be and really looks like something like this. In fact, what we're actually discussing here, what he's discussing, is what this man found out, who was a theologian and a priest who turned agnostic after looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and finding out that all this is just comparative religion, and they're actually and purposely trying to put things in there, and he didn't even probably understand it to the point of things that I've shown you recently, where here's this Greek story right there. It sounds kind of weird. You get in the Bible and all of a sudden this weird thing happens, and you're like, what the hell is that all about? Well, that comes from this Greek tale from long before it. Why do they feel like they got to throw it in there? Because they're trying to throw in all these things and make it an all for one kind of situation, and kind of give you an idea of where we came from. Was that where we came from? No, because first of all, it gives you an idea that we were at best, if not even existent, at 4000 BC or a little after, and then God created everything and da-da-da. It tries to omit the actual origin of everything and put it on an idea of a people. Which we look at the Sumerians and everything like that, and we because we can see their literature, how steeped it is in things, and how they have deep geometry at this time, and mathematics and all kinds of stuff, and it shows you that it didn't come up like popcorn. Although strangely they credit their gods with having this idea, and like, did the idea of a plow come from like a bull stuck on a piece of a tree one time, dragging behind him, and they go, we have to do that by hand. What if I took the bull and I hooked up something to him and I drug it in there, but I was so high when it happened? They say the Enuma Elish, that what's that supposed to say? It says, win on high. So some people say that this is whenever somebody was envisioning when in heaven, or when is that, or when it is that. There's another interpretation that comes out as like, whenever I was high. Now, in a modern day, you would say, this guy was high and he came up with this BS, and you try to discredit him off of that, right? The amazing thing is, back then, whenever somebody had a vision, like it's always talked about in the Bible and all these things like there, it was pretty much understood with everybody, like, okay, you hit a heroic dose and what happened? Or you had a dream and what happened? You look in the Bible and there's a lot about dreams and things like that, and try to drive it out of it. But here we have Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and he wasn't able to play with the other kids and da-da-da and all da-da, but then one day he ended up becoming the hero. That's a story. That's a mythology. It can be the people. It can be whatever you want to, but you can also look at this red and this mushroom and this concept and go, I You can go through the whole story and then turn around and say, I am the deer. There you go. We are the deer. It's amazing there are people that are semi-autistic or so nerdy or things like that, and if they ever, smoke pot or do anything else, all of a sudden they come out of their shell like crazy. They've used drugs like this for all kinds of things. In fact, I saw this thing where this girl was having hundreds of seizures a day, and they gave her some of that squirt pot to her that's concentrated, and inside 10-15 minutes the guy had to hold her. She was just freaking out, and all of a sudden everything, and then all of a sudden she's all right. There's this other guy that can't even open a doorknob. He's jerking and stuff, and like, just incredibly bad. And then they give him a shot of that, and he sits down on the couch, and after a while he's able to relax, and all of a sudden he sits up and he goes, oh wow, and it's like, here you are again. There's my old friend. Some of these things are freaking amazing, but it all comes back from this. And hey, another video coming up, which I'll try to show you, is an idea of primordial chemistry and how it works off geometric shapes and sacred geometry. And that's the way we look at chemistry today, because it's right. And it even hooks up to our DNA and all these concepts. But did they discover all this when they were fucked up and they were looking at this stuff and they were like, hold on a minute, I see some representations and all these are the same, and they would all of a sudden gleam at you and you'd be like, whoa. Or you take some math whiz all of a sudden and get him real high and put him against some of these things, and they go, here you go, here's an equation. You see what I'm saying? Involve a nerd and a chalkboard and all this gets real different. Well, a chalkboard can be a cave wall. A chalkboard can be a lot of things. So, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, here are these red-cap mushrooms, and some looks at them. There's some little ones over there at the right or whatever. And you see those Santa colors and things like that, and the caribou. And people have done studies. This is not something that's like, oh, so this happened one time. No. No, it's got going on today, going on way back when. In fact, if we take it back 100,000 years, was it still going on? They were around, and they're sure this fungus was all around, and they're sure this was just kind of going on. Maybe that's what got us to the point that we're even talking about now. It's crazy. But how far back can you get the origins of Christmas? Well, these people that were experiencing winter and the changes of seasons and having to live off of it came up with these tales long ago. So it easily goes past and into the last ice age. The thing we can't refer to much information out of that is because it goes through a fog. You're out here going through the snow, and if you look over that reindeer's shoulder right there, you just barely see the pine trees. And if you go through those, you can't even see it anymore from here. You're lost in this, well, maybe it was like this, maybe it was like that. Then you have all this conjecture. Now we understand people were much more advanced than we gave credit for, and we couldn't prove it, and everybody was shunning it until we found Göbekli Tepe, and they go, well, what about this? And now everybody's got to go with, yeah, so there were much more. And as soon as that happens, Neanderthals get talked about, how they're so advanced too, and things like that. It's amazing how we've gone through this change just in my lifetime in the idea of when and where, from a religious aspect on 4000 BC or a little more to, oh wow. And of course, during that time, everybody said, well, here's cave art, so boom, here's a fossil. So that never happened. But we're talking about humanity and how it connects to it. So here we go again. Back to Joe.
A cool story.
Oh, dude, it's fucking crazy. So he wrote this book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross that was bought out by the Catholic Church. This I have to verify. But I do know that they stopped production of it. I don't know if it was bought out by the Catholic Church. That's always been what's been told to me. But I do know that they stopped production of it forever. He came out with another book called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth, which is still available. Then, more recently, like really recently, within the last decade, a guy named Jan Irvin republished the John Marco Allegro books with permission from his family. I think it might have actually been one of those things where when a book is over 25 years old, it becomes like public domain or something like that too. But this book and this story behind it is incredibly fascinating. And what he's basically saying is that, and it makes sense, if you were living thousands of years ago and you stumbled upon these psychedelic mushrooms and you took them, you would experience God. You literally would think that that psychedelic state was you communicating with God. They would want to hide those from the Romans, so they hid them in.
They'd want to hide them from everybody, but it would get found out. And eventually you become friends with certain people and allies and so on, and it would become shared as an experience or an idea. But then there were secret societies where things like this would happen with, and so these people knew what they were talking about whenever they were going through things, and the other people wouldn't know. It was just kind of like you knew something was going on, you know? Yeah. And he credits to Romans, and of course when the Bible gets written and how this is done and the Dead Sea Scrolls coming into that time. But this idea is interwoven in the stories of people that are all surrounding and in the ancient Canaanites and so on from way back when. The little pieces of myths and stuff, and they go, now that if you look at it in that aspect, you can go like, this has got something to do with that. Okay, and right over here he says this has got something to do with that. In fact, people have said, well, you know, David used to be a redhead, and this used to be a redhead, and used to be a redhead, and they're always described as that. Is all the redheads that are in the Bible supposed to be making symbology toward they were using this, or they were a people that were about that, or how does this all work really, truly, and stuff? And it's amazing where they took a theologian, again, and they said, hey, figure out what this is all about. And about 10 years into it, he goes, I'm seeing something weird about mushrooms and rituals and sex rites and all kinds of things that are interwoven in this as some type of other mythology that's all in allegory and secondary terms and things like that. And he became agnostic and ended up writing these books that Joe's talking about, which I feel like I need to get a hook onto. I guess I'll look them up here and see if I can find them or reference, or doesn't sound like it with what they did to it that you'll find a free point. But he said he has to verify it, but Christians ended up buying out the book and then putting it out of use. Well, a bunch of people got this, and once it reached past the years that you could have a hold on it, it ended up coming back out. But why would they do such a thing and go through the trouble and buy it out and all that stuff if not for a reason? And it's not just, oh, here's some silly guy on mushrooms that came up with something. They're like, this is a known theologian that was so good, we put him to task on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he came out of it with this. And his examples are too pat to where we don't like this to be, well, no, listen, it's all about this and foo-foo and chum-chum and whoa, look over here, it's a magic trick. And try to misdirect you from the idea of where this all comes from. This is just one little piece here, but it goes with Christmas, so I thought I'd share it with y'all.
Parables and stories, and he explains what the original meaning of all these parables and stories are. Because, of course, you're going from ancient Hebrew, which is extremely complicated language that also involves numbers. The letters are also numbers. And then that's translated to Latin and to Greek and then eventually to English. So a lot is lost in that translation. So it really takes a linguist and a biblical scholar to kind of understand whether or not what this guy is saying is correct. I'm obviously not one of those, so I'm just talking shit. But there's so many parallels. It's almost like, how could it be just coincidental that Santa Claus is red and white, that Santa Claus likes reindeers, that the Christmas tree is something that we use and the presents are under the Christmas tree, that Santa Claus lives in the fucking North Pole, which is Siberia, which is where caribou live, and which is where these mushrooms are very common. I mean, there's so many parallels. It's really kind of fucking crazy.
That's cool.
So, yeah, so he puts it all together right there, too. And I don't know, man. I just like it whenever somebody else goes through a series and just kind of validates everything and goes, here you go. Now, you could say that he heard the same crap from the same guy. Again, so I try to go off something that's worth a crap. And listen, some stoner that's been studying for a long time and figured some stuff out is great, too, as long as he doesn't take it too far. I find most of them go, and therefore aliens or whatever at one point, and it shows you something that, you know, disvalidates a lot of the other part. But you would think that something as odd and weird as this would probably try to disvalidate it. No, this guy's a theologian, scholar, told to work on the Dead Sea Scroll, a priest, all this, that, and the other, becomes an agnostic, realizing that it all comes from roots from other stuff, and this is just a copy in a way. But what's the weird thing that stood out to them? Well, this is all about these ancient rites and stuff like the Sumerians had and all these other things that go on. And then these other people have ended up making so many connections to the ancient Sumerian tales and some of the tales from Egypt and this, that, and the other, and they know that it's all pulled out of it. I watch a lot of videos that ended up showing where guys have specialized into it and they found one thing. And I consider that a piece of the puzzle. And it's a pretty big puzzle. It's like a 4x8, and these are little pieces here. But once you get enough of them in place, you really can see what this actually is. You'll be like, okay, this is a giraffe over here, and there's a bunch of daisies. And I found this other piece, and it sounds familiar, but I see some daisies on it. So it goes right over here with this, but I haven't found yet the attachment. Oh, wow. You know what the attachment is? Both these rituals that go along with this or have to do with some type of mushrooms. We talk about the ancient Aryans with the soma drinks that they had that are hooked up with cannabis and ephedra and opium, but then they made spiced wines and all kinds of drinks that they would use for other rituals in certain situations that were a little more like this or a little more like that, or they had other things in them. And one of the things they found in one of the setups was mushrooms. And it's not a uncommon thing. But I'm not telling you these people all day long that were doing this and this. No, 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 no. There were priests that were doing this type of stuff. There were rituals. At one point, there were rituals of coming to manhood and things like that that had to do with this same type of ritual where you'd go through and shed your skin like that snake in Gilgamesh and become a grown-up. It's kind of like nowadays whenever Dad cracks the first beer and hands it to you. That's about as close as we can get in the modern day because of the modern psyche against everything like pot and this, that, and the other. But it makes connections to, that it's well known that the festivity, getting a little drunk, doing whatever is great during the holidays or whatever. It makes light of this death of the year and the flip we go through that goes through the whole time. It's another reason why we put this glorious holiday that gets everybody together in a time which deserves warmth and getting together, so it makes it all work for people like it used to in the ancient times. And how ancient? Well, when we were still hunter-gatherer type of people, perhaps even 100,000 years ago, things like this were coming into play when people came together and they knew that it was happening. In fact, here's another concept where somebody believed, this is one of those through the fog bullshit things where you don't know if it works or not. But these guys would get the reindeer high, so they'd put out this ammunition. So apparently they were going through it and then pissing and doing stuff, but also leaving some out to where they would eat them, catching where they eat them. But in this place, there was a ravine over here. And there's an effect to this day whenever deer even run towards going an overpass and this, that, and the other, they'll hop over the guardrails. But sometimes where they hop over the guardrails is 100 foot down and they end up going to their death. There's a place I could show you where they ended up putting up all this fence because of deers, and they try to make it to where you don't try to cross here. If you could do it 100 yards down, you just go right down in the ravine. But here you go, wah! That's why we built the bridge. But they would just run and just jump off to their death, and then that would feed the whole group that was getting together, like at some place like Göbekli Tepe or so ever. Oh man, I can't find the little ravine and this, that, and the other. And it used to be vegetated all here, and this was part of even the Lebanon forest or whatever. And these mushrooms must have been in this area, or they did this thing. But there's this idea that part of that rituals of hunter-gathering and stuff even has connections to do with that, but also a time of year and all this stuff. And of course, Santa lives in the North Pole, which what time is it there? If you look at lateral longitudinal lines, from there you can take off and do all kinds of things. Anyhow, I just thought I'd share that with you. Pretty neat. And of course, you got to add Joe Rogan into it. I don't know if I'll get flagged for having Joe on or not or whatever. Probably will, because I let him talk more than a minute at a time. But I think it's good information, needs to come together. And then again, the one connective I have here is this ritual of the Sumerians. He hooks Jesus back up to that, which is Dumuzi and so on, and the rituals that come from that, and in a later time, and in an earlier time. They tell you it comes from a time well before they baked bread, but then there's also all these other rituals that are hooked up with it. They ended up going to the Celts and all the people that came and went through up there and what they had going on. And some of these people we look at as being the people that had that elf concept going on, so they're the elves of old, and they're part of this still at the same time. They have 20 years and do all that? No, they never really did. But it's, you see, you put it all together, and there's these elves, and they da-da, and the Santa Claus, and da-da-da, and they got all these rituals, this, that, and the other. The thing that you don't want to throw, you want to go ching, 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 and they had little bells, and they did little things, and da-da-da. And that's great, and they made incredible things that nobody else could make. So this is almost like the forge of the gods and all that type of stuff that they got working on too. They could make all these things and pass them out and stuff. Because this idea and ideas came from this. That people like, yeah, the idea here is after you had this, you had enlightenment. You talked with God, so you had an enlightenment. By having such an enlightenment, you might come up with something new, something innovative, something nobody's ever thought of. You put two and two together. Something that we adopted not too long ago could be done in a different way. You could end up taking this and that, and then the ox pulls the plow. And everybody at the party be like, dude, and the next thing you know, here we have stricter agriculture. Or somebody says something like, what if we build a little creek that goes off the river, but not all the way there, just when it gets up to full, and that way it'll spill over way down here and we can take the river wherever we want to. Or we're going to take it all the way down to Jeff's spot there and then let it spread out. Dude, that's irrigation. Where'd you get that from? The gods, like we were all there when we were fucked up on mushrooms and doing this, and we already had it right in front of us, and then somebody went, hey man, what if you 1 and 2 and it makes 3? And then everybody was like, dude, think about that, seriously. In a way, that's how innovation happens a lot of times, but it's very possible with this stoned ape theory from the Wayback Machine all the way through that this was still being utilized in a way, and makes you wonder how much of it is used in a modern day, and if we tried a little, what we could come across. And when we came across it, even in a modern day with our incredible spaceman computer things, it would become the next thing that would be like, dude, and we'd go from there. Happy holidays. Peace.